Chapter 3. Justifying Medical Action. Grounds of Justification. Our law recognizes grounds of justification for medical interventions, which may be raised to absolve the medical practitioner of liability by excluding wrongfulness or unlawfulness. These include informed consent, emergencies, medical necessity, therapeutic privilege, statutory authority, and obtaining court orders. Informed consent lets the patient consider the risks before allowing treatment, the proof of which is dependent on the presence and appreciation of sufficient knowledge in order to understand the nature of the treatment, especially the risk of harm, dangers, complications, or any other negative effects, especially those which are more serious in nature. What is consented to must also not be in conflict with public policy, must be given by a person capable in law of consenting, must be free and voluntary, and the consent must be clear, decisive, and precede the treatment. Consent is, however, not required in emergency interventions where the patient is unconscious, in great shock, in a coma, otherwise unable to consent or comprehend, or the patient's condition is life-threatening. Consent is also not required when refusal of consent in an emergency situation is to the patient's own detriment and necessary action is thus of medical necessity. Similarly, therapeutic privilege would also negate the consent requirement and refers to a practitioner not informing a patient fully of risks and harm due to the fear that the patient may not cooperate when having regard to the patient's psyche, which would be against his best interest. Escaping liability for deviation from the procedures and treatments a practitioner did obtain informed consent for would be possible only in circumstances where a more reliable diagnosis could not have been made earlier, and the extension of the treatment would improve the patient's condition. It is thus better to rather obtain consent for any deviation unless it is impossible, for example, in a surgery situation. In some cases, statutory authority allows for medical interventions without consent. These cases include taking blood samples in criminal proceedings and treating or confining patients who pose a serious risk to public health, for example, in mental health or quarantine situations. Court orders can also be sought where medical interventions in life-threatening situations are of absolute necessity, such as parents refusing consent to a medical procedure that is in the best interest of their child. Of all the defenses, informed consent is possibly the most important. Notwithstanding who you act for, you will be well advised to establish whether informed consent by the patient is present. When informed consent is absent, this will constitute a delict.